My initial idea for this video was to make a simple comparison between two different symbols from two different movies. And I'm still going to do that a little later on in the video, but when I started to outline what I was going to say, I quickly realized that I can't really make this comparison without first talking about symbolism in the broader sense. That's because if your educational experience was anything at all like mine, then you will have been taught in all your literature classes how to find symbols, how to hunt for them like Easter eggs. But one question that never seemed to be answered, or even asked, was, why? Okay, so I found a symbol. What do I do with it? In school, the answer's easy. You write a paper about it. But what about outside the classroom? Why do we care about symbols? Why are they important? The answer to that question always seems to be implied, but never outright stated. It's implicit in the fact that we pay so much attention to symbols that the object of all that attention must be significant enough to warrant it. But this creates a kind of circular logic that never seems to go anywhere. We have to find symbols because they're important. Symbols are important because, well, they must be. Why else would we go to all the trouble of finding them? But nowhere in this self-affirming feedback loop are any explicit ties to quality. What makes a work of art good or bad? Again, it's often implied that symbolism correlates with quality, but there seems to be little interest in explaining the mechanisms by which this is true or untrue. Or at least, I've never seen anyone try. So, I'm going to take a crack at it. The common perspective underlying all the videos on this channel has been that the goal of art is to convey emotions, aesthetics, themes, or whatever else might be included in an artist's vision. From this perspective, if we want to find an explicit link between symbolism and the value of a work, such a link would have to demonstrate how symbolism can help communicate the artist's vision effectively. I guess the first question is, does this link exist? And if so, what is it? I think it does exist, and it has to do with condensing meaning. When I think about the works that have had the biggest impact on me, they have almost never made that impact through sheer volume of meaningful content. If that were the case, art criticism would be pretty easy. The longest book would be the best book. So volume isn't really the parameter of concern. What really sets apart the best works to me is how concentrated the meaning is. The way I think of it is like if you've got two glasses, a tall glass of water with a squeeze of lemon, and a shot glass filled with pure lemon juice. If we're talking just in terms of volume, the glass of water might actually contain more lemon juice than the shot glass, but because the pure lemon juice is more concentrated, it will deliver a stronger sensory impact, a swift, tart punch to the taste buds. I think of art in a similar way. A condensed and focused work, where meaning is concentrated, will be more capable of delivering a stronger impact. If you've seen my videos on holism, this should all sound pretty familiar. If we want to create these kinds of works, symbolism is an important tool. That's because, well, think about what a symbol is. It's where something has its own meaning, but also stands for something else. So when we use symbolism, we're basically stacking meaning on top of meaning, and this allows us to cram more meaningful content into the same amount of space, whether that space be word count, minutes of film, or square inches of canvas. The result is a higher concentration of meaning, leading to works which are more like lemon juice and less like lemony water. Or, to put it another way, I like to think of this idea as kind of like Alton Brown's rule for kitchen tools, namely that he only allows multitaskers in his kitchen because unitaskers take up more space than they're worth. By that logic, symbols are desirable things to put in our works by virtue of how they can fulfill multiple functions simultaneously. And it's not like the efficient use of space is a foreign concept in art either. I'm sure we've all heard that rule about how you shouldn't leave any blank space on the canvas. I think of symbolism as kind of an extreme extension of that idea, where not only are you filling the actual physical space on the canvas, but you're also filling in additional figurative canvases superimposed onto the first. So, now that we've found some kind of link between symbolism and value, does that mean we should start filling our works with symbolism indiscriminately and they'll be good no matter what? Well, not really. In fact, the mechanism I've just described leaves a lot of room for symbolism to actually be detrimental to a work. the way I see it, there are at least two big caveats that come with this way of looking at symbols. The first caveat is that each additional layer of meaning gives diminishing returns. Think about it. There's got to be some kind of upper limit on the amount of information one sentence, or 1 minute, or 1 square foot could possibly hold. As that limit is approached, it's going to get harder and harder to squeeze more information into that space. At a certain point, any additional layers would have to begin encroaching on the existing layers, and this can ultimately hurt the work more than it helps it. For example, I can think of a fair few number of works that have staked their claim to fame on the fact that any given sentence can be interpreted 10 different ways. But it seems to me that if a sentence is legitimately able to be interpreted in any one of 10 different ways, then the language of that sentence would have to be so vague and generalized that it wouldn't be able to convey any one of those meanings with any kind of specificity or force. That brings us back into lemony water territory. The second caveat is that in almost every circumstance, the first or base layer of meaning will be the most effective at conveying ideas. This follows naturally from the idea of diminishing returns. If each layer gives a diminishing return, then the first layer will yield the most return. That being the case, it makes the most sense to take full advantage of this layer before moving on to additional layers. Another way to think of this is to return to the idea of blank space on the canvas. We could imagine a scenario where an artist creates a richly symbolic painting with tons of layered meaning, but it only occupies a small corner of the overall canvas. The symbolism may be great, but it doesn't make up for the fact that most of the canvas is blank. In other words, the difference in meaningful content between blank and not blank is pretty much guaranteed to always be bigger than the difference between one layer of meaning and 2 or more. In this case, focusing on additional layers of meaning would be an inefficient use of the space when so much of the canvas remains blank. It defeats the whole point of using symbolism in the first place. There's a certain intuitiveness to this idea that really matches up with my experiences. What's really saying is that symbolism can't act as the substantive foundation of a work. Rather, it's the extra step that takes a work to the next level. It seems to me like symbolism is often what separates a great work from a work that's just good, but it's almost never the difference between a work that is good and one that is bad. Most great works would still be pretty good if you took all the symbolism out of them, but bad works still tend to be bad even if they use lots of symbolism. I think that all of this is a pretty robust explanation of what symbolism offers, but to be clear, it's not a universal explanation as it's tied pretty heavily to my personal value system. If your values differ, you may find that it doesn't explain things as well for you. But for me, it explains many things that the alternative, the implicit assumption of value, fails to explain. One such example is the comparison I said I would make at the very beginning of the video, and I think we're now ready to make that comparison. The two symbols I want to compare come from two different movies, Anthony Mann's 1952 western Bend of the River, and the more recent Gravity from Alfonso Cuarón. The reason I want to look at these two movies in particular is because they have very similar central themes, namely a protagonist who, in the process of trying to escape the past, undergoes a personal rebirth, accompanied by strong implications of spiritual rebirth as well. Both movies use symbolism to convey this theme, but they do it in different ways that yield different results. First, let's look at Bend of the River. In this movie, Jimmy Stewart's character Glenn McClintock is a former border raider who attempts to leave behind his violent past by helping a group of homesteaders establish a settlement in Oregon. Along the way, he meets Emerson Cole, another border raider, who acts as the personification of Glenn's past. The symbol I want to look at appears during the movie's final climactic action sequence, where Glenn and Cole, while entangled in hand-to-hand combat, take a spill into the river. A dunk in the water like this is a pretty common symbol used in literature to evoke the idea of a baptism, signaling a birth or rebirth. Soon after, Glenn triumphs over Cole, and Cole's disappearance into the water visualizes Glenn's sin being figuratively washed away by the baptismal waters. This scene does a lot of work. Aside from its symbolic contribution to the movie's theme, it also carries the literal significance of being the protagonist's final triumph over the villain. It's a fantastic example of symbolism as a multitasker, and it shows why this multitasking is effective. as each meaning elevates the other. The figurative victory adds greater significance to the literal victory, while the literal victory makes the figurative victory that much sweeter. The cumulative effect of this scene and others like it throughout the movie is a powerful and compelling realization of the story's central themes. Now let's take a look at a scene from the movie Gravity. In Gravity, Sandra Bullock's character Dr. Ryan Stone attempts to escape the trauma of her daughter's accidental death by becoming an astronaut. During an ordeal that strands her in orbit, she undergoes a personal rebirth that renews her will to carry on into the future. This rebirth is visualized throughout the movie, including in what would become the movie's most famous image, the Fetus Shot. This is the symbol I want to focus on in this movie. In this shot, Stone removes her spacesuit before curling up into the fetal position, while hosing in the background floats into frame to create the visual suggestion of an umbilical cord. This reinforces the idea that Stone is in the middle of a gestation period, undergoing the process of being born again. In this capacity, the scene serves as a figurative contribution to the movie's themes. But what literal meaning does it carry? We see that Stone is distressed, but we already knew that. Okay, she takes off her spacesuit, and then... is there really a reason for her to stop everything in this high-pressure and time-sensitive situation to curl up in a very specific way for who knows how long? You could come up with some kind of a justification. She's tired, she's stressed, she's not in a good state of mind, she's stopping for a rest. But the real question is, if this scene had no symbolic significance, would it still be in the movie? I don't think so, and in fact, it seems to exist solely on the basis of its figurative meaning. This might sound like speculation, but I think we could find support for this idea within the film itself. For example, Gravity takes place almost entirely in real time, with very few cuts that indicate a passage of time. One of these cuts comes later in the movie so that we don't have to take the time to watch Stone get into a spacesuit. If getting into a spacesuit is something that has such little value as a piece of literal information that it is left out of a movie that otherwise leaves almost nothing out, I don't really see how getting out of a spacesuit is so much more important that it warrants the extreme amount of emphasis that's placed on it. Another one of these cuts comes immediately after the fetus scene, indicating that it's not important for us to see whatever else happens after the pose, which in turn can make us question why it was so important for us to see her get into it. All in all, it's incredibly easy to come away from this scene with the impression that it exists for the sole purpose of conveying the figurative womb concept. In other words, it's a unitasker. Unlike the scene we looked at in Bend of the River, there doesn't seem to be a surrogate literal meaning here which can elevate and be elevated by the figurative meaning. It acts not so much as an additional layer of meaning, but rather as more of a replacement. Because of this, it doesn't contribute value in the way we would expect from a symbol, by condensing meaning. Instead, it runs into that second caveat by creating blank space. The movie, the plot, everything is put on hold so that we can watch Stone float in a pose for a long 30 seconds. And while the scene may successfully convey its own symbolic conceit, it does so at the expense of the larger work's overall impact, through dilution, but also through distraction. And let me explain what I mean by that. There's something about this scene that always bothered me from the first time I saw it, but for the longest time I wasn't able to put it into words. I think I finally figured it out though, and it's that the scene seems to want to have things both ways. It wants to be coy, but blatant at the same time. It wants to convey information in an indirect, figurative way, yet it removes any other kind of meaningful or substantial context to ensure that we don't miss the figurative meaning. As a result, it seems less concerned with conveying any kind of specific themes than it is with broadcasting a signal of intent, a signal that the movie intends to be seen as a serious work of symbolic art. But that messaging has everything to do with the movie itself, and nothing to do with Dr. Stone or her rebirth. I don't imagine Anthony Mann was particularly concerned with whether people noticed the symbolism in Bend of the River. Many audiences might not notice the baptism symbology, or the characters' clashing color schemes, or how Glenn clutches the scar at his throat upon seeing Cole, the reminder of his violent past which is finally revealed at the end of the movie, visibly healed over. They might not notice these things, but nobody could leave the theater thinking that the movie was about anything other than Glim's redemption. With Gravity, on the other hand, the fetus scene seems so preoccupied with being noticed that it kind of takes on a life of its own and almost upstages the rest of the movie. Like I said earlier, I think a lot of us have been taught to have a kind of Pavlovian response to symbolism. And that being the case, it shouldn't be a surprise when some works ring the bell as loudly as they can in the hopes of making us drool. But if we want to determine whether or not there's actually any food in the bowl, making direct, independent observations will always be more reliable than a prescriptive criteria like the bell. And I find that to be true in the case of these two movies. It might sound kinda corny, but Bend of the River really reaches me in ways that Gravity fails to, and a lot of this is due to the different ways that each movie uses symbolism. Under an implied value model of symbolism, opinions like mine shouldn't exist. There's no way to explain them. In contrast, the more observational model I've described can not only explain this opinion, but also just about every other opinion I've thrown at it so far. Also, unlike the implicit model, it makes no claims to being a universal explanation that everyone will find equally useful. But for me at least, it seems to work pretty well, and I find that I can hear things much more clearly when I tune out that bell.